It's Berlin briefing time, and over the next 30 minutes, we're going to get you fully briefed up on what signs there are that there just might be a tiny chance of some kind of truce in Ukraine even before Christmas. And we'll fill you in on the European reaction to the new US national security strategy. And we'll also look beyond on what ideological outlook that means for the United States. With me here in the studio to get to the bottom of that, as well as the impact of that new strategy, is Roman Goncharenko, my colleague from DW Russian Service. I have Richard Walker here, DW Chief International Editor, and our Bureau Chief in Washington, Ines Paul. So welcome to all of you. And I want to dive straight in there because Trump just gave the Europeans pretty poor marks over how they are handling Ukraine in an interview they did with Politico. Let's take a listen to that.
They're not doing a good job. Europe is not doing a good job in many ways. They're not doing a good job.
I want to ask
you
about
talk too much, and they're not producing. We're talking about Ukraine. They talk, but they don't produce. And the war just keeps going on and on. But most European nations, they're decaying. They're decaying.
So, Ines, I want to throw that to you. Donald Trump says Europe is decaying, but let's first stick with Ukraine. He says Europeans are just talking. Well, he did talk to the Europeans this week, and his people are going to be doing a lot more talking over the weekend. We're hearing that there may be some concrete territorial ideas for potential concessions that the Ukrainians might be willing to make. What's the state of play of what you're hearing in Washington?
You know, Michaela, we first have to understand that Donald Trump really wants an end of this war. And he doesn't really care about the situation in Ukraine. He wants to be able to make deals with Vladimir Putin. And he doesn't want the Europeans stand between him and Vladimir Putin making these deals. So that is his main take. And he's actually very transparent about that. I mean, leave it to him. He's probably the only president we've had in a long time who really says what he wants to do. The Europeans don't like that in some regards, but he's very open about it. So that's his take. We don't know if this meeting will be taking place maybe on Monday in Germany or not. But what is clear that Donald Trump won't meet Zelensky again if Zelensky is not willing to sign this so-called peace deal. He's not going to have any further negotiations directly with him. He only is going to meet him when he's ready to sign.
Roman, I want to take that to you because it seems to be pretty clear to the Ukrainian President Zelensky as well that he will have to make some kind of territorial concessions. That pressure has been mounting. You were in the room today because Mark Rutte was in Berlin. Also, the German foreign minister was there, and they were discussing that very issue of how concrete and how fast this thing can head towards a concrete kind of truce. And I just want to listen to Johann Wadefuhl, who put this in the context of World War I and World War II, because World War II is widely seen as having broken out because that deal, as one would say in modern Trump English, that ended the First World War wasn't sustainable. Let's take a listen.
We as Europeans know what it means to have a peace deal which is acceptable and bearable for the people in Ukraine, and which in a way also is part of the guarantees we all need for the future, not to be faced with a new Russian aggression in the future.
So as those leaders are holding these various talks, which may or may not take place in Berlin and produce some kind of outcome, what would be required to be bearable, as the German foreign minister put it, for the Ukrainian people?
Well, it's simple. Ukraine needs really ironclad security guarantees if in case Russia invades again. So this means not just a strong Ukrainian army, but something more. And the problem is we do not know what those guarantees could be, because the European leaders and the US president are not giving any details on that. So we've heard something like Article 5 kind of guarantees. On the other hand, it's hard to believe what could be Article 5 kind of guarantees. So will NATO countries go to war with Russia? I cannot imagine that happening. Will they give Ukraine powerful weapons, like, for example, Tomahawk cruise missiles? There was discussion about that, if you remember. Donald Trump suggested that, but that he, after Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, said no go, that would be a red line. Trump stopped talking about it. So that could be as a part of guarantee. So very powerful missiles that the United States could give. The Europeans could say that we are ready to move in with our troops to Ukraine, a small contingent, but we will not deploy our troops close to the front line, or where what is now a front line, but then could be a demilitarized zone or whatever. So the Europeans are ready to move into Western Ukraine, where it's relatively safe. I don't know if Ukraine is ready to accept that. I think yes, but the problem is Russia says we are not accepting any foreign troops, especially NATO troops, in Ukraine. So there are still a lot of questions that are open.
So what are the options on the table, ranging from demilitarized zone, effectively North and South Korea style, to what?
I don't like that comparison to North and South Korea, because in South Korea there are U.S. troops there, and Donald Trump or any other U.S. president.
That's wishful thinking for the Ukrainians.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a wrong example, I think. So Ukraine will be on its own for a moment at least, but the only option that is possibly viable, it would be, and it has been discussed as a possible solution, is a fast-track EU membership. Washington Post wrote about it as one possible solution, but there is strong resistance to that here inside the European Union. So the Europeans are saying we have our procedures, so we are not ready to talk about that. So at the moment, the whole issue is territories. Ukraine is ready to discuss that. And Ukraine is maybe more ready to do that than it was a month or two ago, because the situation on the front is deteriorating and Donald Trump is mounting pressure on President Zelensky. But it is still not clear if Russia would agree to all that. We can discuss all possible solutions, but the problem is Moscow has made it very clear it sees itself, Vladimir Putin, being on the winning side. And I don't believe that Moscow will stop for a while when it sees that the Ukrainian front line is really, it's not crumbling, but it's under enormous pressure. And Ukraine could lose a number of key towns in the coming weeks and months.
And the first challenge, of course, is to get everybody round the table. We don't even know which selection of leaders will be sitting around the table. We expect that to be hosted in Berlin. So once Friedrich Merz, the Americans, the Europeans, the E3, Britain, France and Germany have reached some kind of agreement with Zelensky, and that's palatable for the United States, then Russia is still missing. We had Mark Rutte in Berlin speaking of another force that for sure will not be officially sitting at the table. Let's just take a listen on who he feels could make the difference if they only wanted.
And now is Putin able to continue his war against Ukraine? The answer is China. China is Russia's life. China wants to prevent its ally from losing in Ukraine. Without China's support, Russia could not continue to wage this war.
So, Richard, an open secret, really, but you just traveled with Johann Wadefuhl, the German foreign minister, to China. Why is China not using leverage at this time?
Well, I think China just doesn't really see any need to do that. And I mean, China has always, its line has always been that, this is not our war. This has nothing to do with us. You in the West exaggerate the influence that we would have over Russia, even if we were minded to do something.
Supplying parts, drones.
Yeah, but basically, I mean, if we look at what China has done over the last few years, it's provided an economic lifeline. It buys a lot of Russian energy, a lot of the energy that otherwise would have been going to Western markets. It's become a very important supply. A lot of the cars being sold into Russia now are not coming from the West, they're coming from China. A lot of so-called dual-use goods, so kind of not necessarily weapons, but technologies and components that can go into, for instance, drones and things like that. And also, it's providing diplomatic support. I mean, just the very, very strong sort of message to the world: we are still with Russia. And we saw that, perhaps most strongly in September at the military parade in Beijing, where it was Vladimir Putin with Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping as the centerpiece of this huge kind of demonstration of Chinese might to the world. China saying, he's our guy. And, Johann Wadephul going to talk to his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi and, taking this message again and saying, you are the ones with leverage over Russia, please use it. Well, a year ago, I was there with Annalena Baerbock, Wadephul's predecessor. She went with exactly the same message and nothing changed. And I think you get this sort of impression, okay, we have to keep saying this because if we don't say it, then it looks like we don't care anymore. But we do not expect them to change their position.
And they did weigh in, though, on the nuclear issue. But for them, it's strategically probably pretty interesting to see the Europeans weakened at this point.
Yeah, I mean, on the nuclear issue, I was on that trip as well. So that was Olaf Scholz, the previous chancellor, who went to Beijing around the time of the heightened concern that Vladimir Putin might use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And he did manage to extract from the Chinese, wording about, warning against the use of nuclear weapons. But it didn't necessarily go beyond anything that China had said in public anyway about the nuclear weapons. I mean, there'd not long before that been a statement from the permanent 5 members of the Security Council saying that a nuclear war can never be won and must not be fought. So I mean, that was held up as a kind of a big victory, but some would argue that it had been exaggerated. But yeah, I mean, I think that the bottom line is that the Chinese do not want Russia to suffer a defeat in this war. And Wang Yi, the foreign minister, has even been saying that pretty openly. We hear to European interlocutors this year. And there are fairly obvious reasons for that, because it fears that if Russia did suffer a huge setback, then it would lose its primary friend in its major struggle, which is with the United States.
So let me take this to you, Ines, because all of this is taking place. We're also seeing indications that there could be a breakthrough next week over the frozen Russian assets. But how does Trump's view of a weak Europe fit into that bigger picture that we just saw released, which is the new national security strategy, which paints a picture of Europe in civilizational decline? But also, some say, for instance, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, signals that the United States will stay committed in security terms.
I just want to add something to Richard, because I think that's important to understand. Donald Trump is getting closer than many presidents have been before him to Russia and China again. He's talking openly about a possible G5 summit he would host with China, Russia, India. So he just announced that he's going to send these NVIDIA H200 AI chips to China. So that's really what he wants to do. It's all about business. He wants to do business with China. He wants to do business with Russia. And this is what he cares most about. I think this is important to understand the bigger picture and what's going on here.
While you're there, then people will rightly say, hang on, what's this about Taiwan then? Because the Americans are shifting their attention in security terms towards potentially wanting to defend Taiwan, which is the major chip manufacturer in the world. And at the same time, this new national security strategy completely leaves out the security interests related to China. How do you read that?
That's exactly what Donald Trump does. He keeps all options open. He's also very critical with Taiwan, of course, because he says we have to have all the chips manufacturing options here in our own country, his America First policy. With him, in a way, you never really know, but what we really should have learned over the course of the last 10 years is that he does not care as much about Europe at the transatlantic relationship as we knew it than other presidents have done before him. And Michaela, I want to be kind of open here. I'm actually surprised and how shocked Europe is about this new national security strategy, because we knew all of that. I was in Brussels 10 years ago or 9 years ago when he said he might leave NATO. where's the surprise coming? And why are people surprised that he is criticizing Germany and Europe, that it took a war in Europe before Germany and other European countries are fulfilling, their quota, their money they need to spend for NATO. So this is the American perspective. And I'm surprised how surprised many European leaders are.
Well, there was, because I was traveling with Friedrich Merz when this first 28-point plan on Ukraine came out, and I can really testify that the Europeans were a lot more shocked by that initial Ukraine plan than they actually now were by this new national security strategy, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, this national security strategy was kind of telegraphed to everybody by J.D. Vance in February at the Munich Security Conference. In the speech that he made that we've talked about on a few occasions during the course of this year on Berlin Briefing. What kind of surprises people is this coupling of these two basically separate issues, the security of Europe and saying that Europe needs to step up and take on more responsibility for its security, which basically the European countries, they accept that, but coupling it to this kind of civilizational question, So J.D. Vance in his speech in Munich was going on about, supposed threats to freedom of speech. This also comes up in this strategy, and also the strategy talks about this idea of civilizational erasure, that essentially saying that Europe is the nature of Europe is being changed by mass immigration. But I also want to...
hinting at this replacement theory.
Exactly, and sort of hinting at a kind of ethno-nationalism, and also kind of hinting that in the long term, well, if you keep doing that, then we might not want to stick with you in the future because you won't be Europe anymore. But I do think we also that there's been a lot of hyperventilating in Europe about these elements, this kind of heavily kind of culture war kind of vibe within the national security strategy. But we need to balance that also with the parts of the national security strategy which do actually emphasize commitment to Europe. For instance, saying that Europe remains strategically and culturally vital to the United States. Crucial, one of the pillars of American prosperity. We cannot afford to write Europe off. Number 3 in the absolute kind of their top vital national interest is supporting our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe. So there is actually kind of balancing that. There is quite a lot of commitment to Europe, and also fighting China or Taiwan may not be specifically mentioned in there, but it does say we will build a military capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain. So first island chain, Taiwan is, so that's the chain of islands, sort of just one set of islands outside China. Taiwan is part of that. So that's an indirect reference to Taiwan.
To the previous long-standing commitment of the United States that it would always enable Taiwan to be able to defend itself.
Yeah, but they want to be capable of denying the aggression. So it is essentially underlining long-standing US policy there.
As policymakers and intellectuals and analysts here in Europe debate whether this is more of an ideological manifesto or more of a policy paper that will actually be translated into action, the bottom line, of course, is would the US stick with NATO? And Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, got that question on a panel here in Berlin just a few hours before we recorded this, asking him whether he could envisage a NATO without the United States. Let's take a listen.
No, I don't see that. I think it is crucial that we keep the transatlantic bond as strong as it is today, and it is very strong. When you look at the national security strategy the US brought out, I know there was a lot of talk, of course, in European capitals, but look at what is actually saying. Complete commitment to European security, complete commitment to NATO, and a complete commitment to the fact that we can only defend the Euro-Atlantic area if we stick together.
So, Roman, it is the job of the NATO Secretary General to create a complete confidence in NATO as well. When you heard that, you were in the room. What were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking paper is patient, as they say in Germany, So I would not exaggerate the consequences of that strategy, because strategies change, presidents come and go. But on the other hand, Richard, you are absolutely right. This is the message we heard in Munich from J.D. Vance. So this could remain there, at least as long as Donald Trump remains president. But on the other hand, people I've been talking to, Americans, American intellectuals, experts on security, are saying, yes, Europe should do more. Europe has understood that it should do more. It is doing more. We can talk and argue about the pace. And Mark Rutte said today the pace is not sufficient. He said we need to speed up. And this is the message we're hearing from many NATO officials, from generals. We've been hearing it here in Berlin just a few weeks ago at the Berlin Security Conference, with German generals also saying we don't have time, we have to speed up. The speed is so the pace is not sufficient because Russia could attack or test, as they say, NATO in just a few years. And just imagine what struck me today when Rutte was talking. He was trying to convey the same message we've been hearing, but in harder words. He said himself it was a tough message or a hard message, and the message is: if Ukraine loses this war, NATO is the next. And NATO is not yet ready. This is what was he trying to convey. So yes, we are ready. He has to say that, but we need to speed up. We need to reform our armies. We need to buy more weapons, powerful weapons, and it's a long process. And he was also using that analogy with World War II. He didn't say that exactly, but he said it could be a kind of a war that our parents and our grandparents had to live through. And those were strong words, if you ask me.
It was a very alarming message for someone who's supposed to instill confidence in NATO, also speaking of the fate of Ukrainians going to bed and not knowing whether they will wake up could then also affect NATO territory. So I'd say that for a NATO Secretary General, this was the most populistic alarming message to a general public as well. Ines, I want to quote one thing from the national security strategy to you. And here, it's not just these concerns that are voiced in there about the civilization that could be erased, which is a complete anti-migration message, but also the wish for aligned states rather than a European Union. Does Trump essentially just want to blow up the European Union?
Well, he's much more interested in direct deal-making options. He doesn't believe in these transnational institutions as the European Union or the United Nations because it's easier for him to make direct deals. And Michaela, I was just thinking a little bit about your question, if it's like, is it ideological or is it political? I mean, we have to bear in mind Donald Trump's policy is highly, highly ideological. And he is a deep believer that the white European race is in danger, and that migration kind of is posing a huge threat to that. And that is behind his thinking and also behind the thinking of Peter Thiel, for example. And when we talk about the MAGA ideology and the Donald Trump ideology, I think we always have to keep in mind that they really copied a lot from Viktor Orban, who is also a white nationalist. I think that is fair to say in many regards. So this is kind of a little bit of the bigger thinking why they are so strictly against migration or fighting like migration in their own country and in Europe as well. That's the ideological policy they are doing here in the United States.
Yeah, and Trump's been very open in his support for Viktor Orban. Friedrich Merz was at pains this week to explain a comment that he made that if Trump can't really, he can't really speak to European institutions, at least he could then have Germany as partner. And then he was at pains to explain that Germany could be speaking for other European partners as well. But based on this whole set of events that he's been through, the 28-point plan, which is still evolving, the initial 28-point plan, and this new national security strategy, this is the message that he had in response to a question on that.
This security strategy, which the Americans published last week, is not really a big surprise following the speech given by the American Vice President at the Munich Security Conference, which I'm sure you all heard and remember. In this respect, we're preparing ourselves for a change in transatlantic relations, but I would still like to see it as a partnership, and I hope that America sees it the same way with regard to Europe and also with regard to Germany.
He also said that these are really tougher, different times, and he's at pains to explain this to his own coalition here in Germany, isn't he, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, Michaela, you interviewed Merz very shortly after the J.D. Vance speech back in Munich just in February. And I remember, he was absolutely kind of fresh out of witnessing that speech. And I mean, you'll have to, I need to turn like presenter on you. Like, remind me, what did he say? I mean, there's definitely a through line, and he has kind of drawn a through line between that speech, his experience there, and then a lot of the decisions that Germany has taken in the time since then of, like, you know, changing its constitution to enable much more spending on defense and all of that to become a kind of a Trump-friendlier Germany.
Well, that was after Vance said there's no room for a firewall, and he meant the firewall agreement by parties of the centre not to cooperate with the far-right Alternative for Germany party. And he basically said that Europe won't be lectured on how to conduct its democracy. And this was only a couple of days before he was actually elected. He was still the Chancellor candidate. So that was seen as quite a shock here in German political circles. But this now seems to have become policy, because we also see it in this national security strategy.
Well, I think, and one of the lines on this kind of like this sort of civilizational erasure and all of that really sticks out and troubles people is it says that they want to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So that sounds like an explicit decision to, okay, we're going to start intervening in European societies and in European politics. So what does that potentially mean? We saw the first glimpses of that in Munich, where J.D. Vance met the head of the AfD party, the far-right party, Alice Weidel. He did that sort of away from the cameras. What next? Maybe it's before the cameras next time. If you see Musk as a kind of an outrider of all of this, he explicitly endorsed
he made a star appearance
the
at a party
AfD
conference
in that election campaign. Trump said in that interview that we saw that he sort of endorses some European politicians. For instance, he endorses Viktor Orban. What happens in the next French election, which is the next of the really big, European countries to hold elections? What if he endorses, the National Rally, so the far right candidate in that? How far does this go? This idea of cultivating resistance.
Well, let's ask Ines.
Does it go to funding? Does it go to funding, sort of grassroots bodies in Europe in the way that they complained that the Open Society Foundation, for instance, funded liberal movements within countries?
Yeah, Ines, I mean, this whole document breathes a perception by the Trump administration that European nations, and without naming them, he clearly means Germany, he means France, are run de facto by minority coalitions, and that the majority, as in the far-right movement, isn't really listened to. So would you put it past the Trump administration to actively get involved in elections beyond what was then perceived to be outrageous comments by J.D. Vance almost a year ago?
I mean, it's interesting that Markus Frohnmayer and 5 others or 6 others are right here in Washington right now. Markus Frohnmayer is a head, or one of the heads of the leading figures in the AfD. There will be a huge gala in New York on Sunday from the Young Republicans in New York, and they're a very, very conservative branch of the Republican Party. Markus Frohnmayer will be awarded an award, and J.D. Vance will be there. There are constantly meetings between members of the Trump administration and AfD members. There's a huge exchange. But I just want to pose this as a question. Aren't we naive thinking that the United States never intermingled in European elections? And to put it like in the other direction, from an American perspective, from a perspective of the Trump administration, so many European leaders were so much in support of Joe Biden and later Kamala Harris, and they tried to do everything to avoid or to stop a second Trump term. Why should he not say, hey, I, of course, have my personal interests in European elections? I'm not saying that this is right, but I just want to kind of show or kind of reflect a little bit on the perspective from the Trump administration.
Roman, I'll let you react to this.
Just a short notice on that. We are talking about, if we are talking about Germany and AfD, of course we are seeing that they are getting closer to the US administration. But on the other hand, it could backfire on them.
Exactly, like in France.
Because there are a lot of voters, AfD voters, who don't like America. Mm-hmm. So it's not so easy.
And I just want to completely underline what Ines said. And I was in the States for a couple of months with Ines and the team there in Washington around that time, and you really felt the absolute scathing attitude of the Republicans towards Germany. And I think you can really see in some of, we're starting with that speech, but all of this right through this year it's partly kind of getting back at Europe for what they see as the arrogance of the Europeans towards Donald Trump, like all along, throughout Trump's time in politics. They feel that he was being viewed with contempt by the Europeans, never taken seriously. This is part of the comeback for that.
So
I would like to jump in here, if I might, Michaela, because I disagree with you and Roman a little bit that it might backfire. It's true, it could backfire. Everything can backfire. The closeness from the AfD with the Trump administration, but of course it's getting easier for the AfD to partner with Donald Trump. Why? Because he's not so critical with Russia anymore, and he is supporting this very nationalistic approach from the AfD. So I think the hope, this friendship, this new love won't last forever. I would be careful with that, because I think this is a beginning of a deepening relationship between the far right parties, not only in Germany and the United States, but across Europe, because of course the Trump administration is in very close contact with nationalists or far-right parties from Hungary, of course, but also in France, in Great Britain, in Spain, in Italy. So this is really a movement which is growing by the minute, and that will change the political landscape. And this will deeply change the relationship Europe had with the United States for many, many years.
That will definitely happen, but also the right-wing populist parties, they're not a monolithic bloc. And we are seeing, for instance, Marine Le Pen of France seeking distance now from the Trump administration. So it's not working for everybody. And I think one of the key tests will be regional elections that we're seeing, particularly in eastern states here in Germany next year. But I want to wrap up today by getting each of you to give me a prediction on where Europe will be with the Trump administration in 1 year's time. We've all learned that 1 year is a very long time in politics, particularly during a Trump administration. So I'm gonna start with you, Ines, giving the others some time to think.
Thank you very much. There will be more direct transnational agreements, less so with Europe, but more like directly with countries.
Richard?
I think quite a lot depends on perceptions of how quickly European rearmament is taking place. And if the Americans start to detect that they think or start to kind of broadcast that they feel the Europeans are dragging their feet on their commitments, their commitments going back to the Hague summit of 5% GDP spending, obviously that's over a given timeline. But if it starts to look there's significant foot dragging, then I think that could be very combustible for the relationship with the US. And I think that's part of the background to Mark Rutte. What he's saying is that this urgency is necessary not just to keep Putin at bay, but it's also to keep Trump on side.
Thanks, Richard. We're going to practice what one sentence means when the mics are off.
Okay.
Well, to wrap it up, I would say, coming back to the title of the show, I don't believe in peace before Christmas because Russia is not willing to end the war. And a lot of how the future relationship between the US and Europe will develop will depend on the end of that war, how it will end. And it will drag on. And if Trump switches to support Russia and do business with Russia, which I don't believe will happen, but if, then it will divide Europe and the United States finally. But I'm cautiously optimistic that this will not happen.
Now, I like to end these recordings telling you that you're fully briefed up, but you're clearly not. You are briefed up as much as possible on the state of play and when it comes to those talks that are going on in the background and also very publicly about any kind of potential agreement towards a truce in Ukraine and what that new national security strategy for the United States means for partners, mainly in Europe, but also around the world. So thanks for listening to us this week. And don't forget to check out the Berlin Briefing newsletter that comes into your inbox if you so wish. And do drop us comments on which areas of this and which topics you would like us to zoom on into in the upcoming episodes.